go.
All right.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is episode 2. Yeah.
Episode technically 2.
Okay.
Technically 2, almost 3. Welcome to the Writer's Block, a kind of short series where we talk about writing, tips for writers at Fordham University or anywhere in general. And today, Peter and I are going to talk about simple versus complete subjects. So this is kind of one of those things that gets, whenever you hear the term write in complete sentences, a complete sentence is defined by having a subject and a predicate. Now, the predicate we'll get to another time, but a subject is, well, Peter, can you tell me what a subject is?
The subject is the thing that a sentence is about. So it's usually the noun, and it is that the subject is not the action happening in the sentence normally.
Yeah. So the subject is quite simply what it's about. Typically a noun, a person, or a thing, or an idea. And the predicate is what it's doing or some information about that completes the sentence. Now, English is what we call an SVO language, a subject, verb, object language. So whenever we think in sentences, we put a lot of weight on the subject. It's the first thing that sort of sets the tone for our writing. Peter, do you speak any other languages?
I don't speak any other languages very well. I took Spanish for a bit, but I'm still a CSE with my comprehension. And as we were discussing, my fiance is French, so I'm desperately trying to learn French. Slow going.
Okay. So I speak a bit of German, and German is a subject, verb, object language, but I also speak Irish, and Irish is a verb, subject, object language. And so in Irish, we weight the verb at the start of a sentence a lot more. So it's a little bit weird to think of it as like, well, you start thinking in verbs rather than start thinking in subjects. So for any ESL students that might be listening on this, English is built around subjects and nouns and then telling us about that. So we establish whatever a sentence is about first thing.
Yep.
Okay. I've got a few, excuse me?
Oh, sorry, if I can jump in for 1 second. I know from my own experience in teaching composition courses that sometimes these terms can be sort of overwhelming, right? Especially predicate, right? Predicate is not a term that most people encounter outside of grammar, and grammar can be scary and off-putting to lots of people. And so I guess just a quick reminder that like terms like this, subject, predicate, it's really just like the thing in the sentence and then what that thing is doing. And so if you're like me, sometimes you can get turned off by the terminology, but the logic behind the terminology is pretty simple.
Yeah. And I do feel that that's a holdover of grammar being taught a little too much by the book. Yep. But going against exactly that, I think we should look at some examples, because the best way to tell the difference between subject and predicate is to look at some writing. So I'm just going to share my screen right here. And I've got a couple selected sentences. So we have 5 sentences here. Some are sort of modified from students' essays. Some are from my own. I thought we could just go through and maybe identify what the subject and complete subject is in each of these. And maybe even point out predicate and maybe offer some editing change. So number 1, growing up, New York seemed like another planet to me. What do you think, Peter?
So I have an issue with the growing up, right? It's sort of a bit awkward of who's growing up, but beyond that, if I were a Comp 2 student, I would look at this sentence and I would wonder whether New York was the subject or whether me was the subject. But you have an excellent explanation for which is which here.
Yeah, so technically, New York is the subject of the sentence. But if you're thinking in colloquial English, there's sort of an unspoken, growing up, I thought New York was another planet to me. It's sort of like pushed the actual subject to the very end. And this is a pretty common grammatical error that people do. The growing up right now is modifying New York. So if New York is a simple subject, the complete subject would be growing up New York. And so when we think about that like that, well, we're not talking about New York growing up. We're talking about the person growing up. And so if it doesn't make logical sense, we should just change the subject there. Growing up, and then we have to change our verb, or I thought New York was another planet.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I think as you were saying earlier, Cahill, right? If you have to read a sentence twice, and if you're sort of not sure where the subject might be, if it's your own sentence, you might consider rewriting it just so it's simpler. Because if you're not sure, then your reader probably isn't sure.
Yeah,
as well.
And again, because English is such a very ordered language, we've got the subject, verb, object. The easiest way to kind of to decide where the subject is to find the verb. And in this case, the verb is seemed, right?
Yep.
And so everything before that is probably going to be our subject, and everything after is going to be part of the predicate. The verb itself is also part of the predicate. So just finding the verb will tell us everything before that. That's what the sentence is supposed to be about. So let's find the verb in sentence number 2 here.
I'm gonna take this one, number 2. I like this sentence. So the GT40, famously driven by Ken Miles, proved that Ford could compete against Ferrari. So I look at this sentence, and the fact that it begins with the and then a noun, the GT40, that's the type of car, is a pretty good indication that that's the verb. And so I'm sorry, that's the noun. And so your simple subject here is just going to be GT40. And you can sort of test that out, because if you jump from GT40 to proved, the sentence works if you take out famously driven by Ken Miles. And so it works. So I know that the simple subject is GT40. And then the interesting thing here is that the complete subject is the GT40 famously driven by Ken Miles. So you've got that half of the sentence. And then this sentence is brilliant because it literally cuts the sentence in half. The first half is the subject, and then the second half begins with your verb, proved.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's good to know that a complete subject can have other nouns in it. It's just telling us something more about whatever the sentence is about, specifying which one typically. So in this case, the GT40, the car that was driven by Ken Miles, and a lot of people would jump to, well, there's a proper noun in there, the proper name, Ken Miles. So that's got to be the subject. Not so much the case here.
And sorry, with this sentence as well, it's it has 3, or I guess technically 4 proper nouns, right? GT40, Ken Miles, Ford, and Ferrari. Mm-hmm. And so it's easy to perhaps think that Ken Miles, the person, or these 2 big companies could be the subject, but that's actually not the case here.
Yeah. And typically in English, we do want to make people the subjects of our sentences. We prefer that. But in this case, it's the car that proves something, not Ken Miles. Now, he was involved, so we want to include him in it. But this is a case where we do want to make sure that the car is the subject. But in sentence 3, it's a little bit different. So let's do sentence 3. Space Station 3, out in orbit around Saturn, was being haunted by the ghost of Carmen Miranda.
All right, you want me to take a stab at this here?
Yeah, I mean, go for it.
So similar to sentence 2, I see that Space Station 3 was being haunted by the ghost of Carmen Miranda. So we could get rid of out in orbit around Saturn, and the sentence would still work, which indicates to me that Space Station 3 is the simple subject, of course, and then that Space Station 3 out in orbit around Saturn is the complete subject. And again, I love it because that's half the sentence. Half the sentence is the subject, and then that gets us to the verb stuff, which gets a little bit more tricky because you have was, you have being, you have haunted. Why don't you take the second half of the sentence here?
Yeah, so the was being haunted, this is kind of, this is what we call passive voice. We'll get into that in a different episode. But because we've got this sort of pushing off of action to the very end of the sentence, was being haunted by Carmen Miranda. You know, we can actually make this a more active sounding sentence just by flipping our subjects and predicates here. So, you know, we've got Space Station 3. Well, let's make that not the actor in this sentence, and instead make the ghost of Carmen Miranda. But you may notice that we have like all these small words, was, being, by, the, of. So let's cut as many of those as we can, and we can just end up with Carmen Miranda's ghost haunted or haunts Space Station 3 around Saturn. And it's same kind of information that we're getting, but suddenly we've got a person or the ghost of a person doing something, and location comes at the very end. So these
oops, sorry, that's a great point. And again, with this sentence, if you were moving quickly and you were looking for the subject, it might be tempting to look at Carmen Miranda, right? Because that's the person. And again, as I was saying, if you wanted to flip the sentence so that the person, Carmen, is doing the thing, you could very easily do that. Although it's a valid sentence either way.
So these next two examples come from some of my own published writing. And I'm putting this out here because, well, I think it's important that even though something's published doesn't mean it's necessarily our best work, or we can't improve it in some way or another. So sentence 4 is pretty unique. We've got the veneration of heroic figures, folk heroes, and the coded language of the revolutionary moment should all give way for the new state. Now, this is a very Ponzi paper about post-colonial Irish stuff. But what do we think is the complete subject? So let's just find our verb and go what's before that.
The veneration of folk heroes. So I see the verb stuff starting, should all give way for the new state. And so I'm going to assume that everything before that is the complete subject. So the veneration of X, Y, and Z. So the veneration of heroic figures, folk heroes, and coded language.
All right, that's absolutely right. But when we get to, so we've got the complete subject. When we get to the simple subject, that is the bare bones of what it is we're talking about, what do we have?
So I'm going to see heroic figures, folk heroes. They're tempting because they're nouns, but I see that the at the beginning of the sentence, and that indicates to me that whatever follows the, in this case, the veneration, just like in sentence 2, it was the GT40, that's in fact the simple subject.
Yeah, and don't forget, we also have and the coded language. So it's veneration and coded language. We've got two objects in our two nouns in our simple subject. And there's a reason. So normally you would want this sort of like a list of veneration, heroes, and language. We'd want that to be at the end of a sentence. But the reason I chose to start this sentence with that is because the next sentence after it was going to be talking about the new state. So I kind of messed around with the form here to make sure that my sentences would all flow together. So you might come across sentences like this in academic writing or in longer form writing, just so that the flow of one sentence to the next sounds better. And when you take them out of context, they look a little bit completely odd, but in the actual document itself, it can work. However, that's not to say sentence 5, I did do something that I probably should never have done. So sentence 5, we've got, the cause of this gap of insight is the narrow window of post-colonial theory and its emphasis on the mainstream. Now, Peter, can you tell me what horrible sin I've done here?
Cause of this gap of insight is the narrow window of post-colonial theory and its emphasis on the mainstream. So this sentence, it's passive, right? It begins the cause of this gap of insight. And so apart from being a little bit confusing to read, I just want to get to the gap of insight or the narrow window. It seems like there's too much stuff, the cause of, before that.
Absolutely. A good thing to look at here is what our verb is, once again. And we've got is. And so anytime we have an is statement, it's generally standing in for a better word. And in this case, the word is the actual subject of the sentence, the cause. I mean, the cause is a noun, sure, but to cause is also a verb. So I can go ahead and cut the cause as the subject and make the subject this gap of insight. This gap of insight causes a narrow window, or something to that effect. I've also done something a little bit odd here in that the subject of my sentence technically is being referred to by its emphasis. So it would be the cause and its emphasis on the mainstream, when clearly what I meant was the theory's emphasis on the mainstream.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So even in like published academic writing, these are sort of issues that we sometimes forget to think about during our revision process, and it makes our own writing clunky. So like I'd take a different pass at this and cut it down entirely if I needed to.
These are great sentences, Kyle. And you mentioned something in number 4 that I think might be a great topic for a future video. You mentioned the context of this sentence, that the next sentence in the paragraph was about the new state. That sounds like a great gesture to the known new contract, which I know blew my mind the first time I learned about it. I'd be thrilled to do a video down the line thinking about that.
I agree. No new contract is definitely something we should get to. But I think the sort of breakdown between simple and complete subject, that can wrap us up for today. So once again, just to reiterate, easiest way to find what the subject of a sentence is in English is to find the verb and look everything that comes to the left of that, everything that comes before the verb. It's probably going to be the complete subject. And then the simple subject is simply whatever word it is stripped of all of its modifiers. All right. Further thoughts, Peter?
I think we've wrapped it up, short and sweet.
All right. Well, have a good day, everyone.
Yep.
Take care.
Thank you for joining.